Welcome to this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today I speak to Rich Beilfuss, who is the CEO and President of the International Crane Foundation. The ICF works worldwide to conserve cranes and their ecosystems, the watersheds and flyways on which they depend on. Tune in to listen to all the great work they do for the conservation of the 15 species of cranes worldwide. Welcome, Rich, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on here. So, what got you interested in working on crane conservation?
Yeah, quite a few things. I've been involved in crane conservation for about 35 years, most of my career. And I think what got me interested in it, I'm a hydrologist actually in engineering, an engineer by training. And I think what's amazing is that in the world of crane conservation, the solutions and the work is very, very diverse. It involves work with communities, it involves conservation of land, water, and wetlands. It involves some things that are very specific to cranes and some issues that are much broader. So it's a very diverse approach to try to save these endangered birds, and it brings together a very wide array of people, and that's what makes it very interesting for me, and why I've stayed in it for so long.
How exactly are cranes different from storks?
So cranes are a family. They are unique from storks, although they look very similar. Cranes are a family of 15 birds worldwide. They're actually surprisingly genetically very different from storks. They look similar, and they have, in some cases, similar feeding niches, so they can easily be confused in different places around the world. People often confuse cranes also with herons and egrets and other birds that have long bills. But there are some unique characteristics to the crane world. Some of the things that make them really magical in a way. They have a unison call where the male and females call together in a harmony for breeding populations. Like as I said, they're distinct birds. Cranes have a different breeding biology also. They only lay one or two eggs per year, so they have very small clutches, very small number of chicks that they rear. Some of those are big challenging conservation challenges, but yeah, they are a distinct group of birds, but often confused in the wild by people.
So, as a taxa, how are cranes faring in regards to their conservation status?
Yeah, cranes are one of the most endangered family of birds in the world. So there are 15 species worldwide. Of those 15 species, 11 are on the IUCN Red List of threatened species. There's one species of crane that's critically endangered, several that are endangered, quite a few others that are vulnerable, and another that is near threatened. So they are a highly threatened family of birds. There are a few species that are not on the IUCN Red List, but even within those species, you have very threatened populations. For example, here in North America, we have the sandhill crane, and the sandhill crane is the most abundant crane species in the world, by far the most successful species. But even within the sandhill crane, we have three populations within that overall population of sandhill cranes. We have three populations that are endangered and highly threatened. And so, yeah, it's a bird family that has really struggled globally. Some great success stories, and many places where they are highly threatened and declining.
Which crane is the rarest?
The rarest crane in the world is the whooping crane, which is here in North America. At its minimum, there were fewer than 20 in existence, and there were only about 15 in the wild when it hit its minimum in the 1940s. So this was as close as you can come to extinction and still turn around. So the population has recovered today. There's about 800 whooping cranes in existence. Some that have been reintroduced, and then a wild population that has recovered to about 550 birds. But it's still by far the rarest crane in the world. It's one of the rarest birds in the world, and I say there's so few that we count them, literally count them in different places, and we can track them as individuals because there's so few.
One of the major threats to cranes is hunting. Why are cranes hunted?
Cranes cranes are an interesting family of birds. They're one of the most revered birds in the world. So there are many places in the world where cranes are not harmed at all. So um, in many cultures, especially in Asia, both in Hindu and Buddhist culture, cranes are considered sacred. And so and in many parts of Africa, they're actually considered, it's taboo to hunt them because of their cultural standing. And so on the one hand, they are hunted in some places, but in many parts of the world, they're actually revered and not harmed at all. So it's quite a contrast. The places where they're most hunted right now, the sandhill crane, which I mentioned is the most abundant crane, is hunted in some parts of North America, largely because of its success and its large numbers. Although those birds, even though they're hunted, are still increasing in numbers, which is good. The other place where they're heavily hunted is in the Middle East. And there the impact of hunting has been very severe through the sort of parts of West Central Asia. There is one species, the Siberian crane, which used to migrate through that part of the world, through Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, parts of far Western Russia. And that entire, the species is still existent, but that entire population, that Western population, was lost largely due to hunting. Well, those birds used to spend the winter in India and in Iran, and they've been largely lost. So there are places where hunting has been very severe, but in most of the world, they're not actually hunted. Yeah. Yeah, our foundation is 50 years old this year, and in the early years of our foundation, that Siberian crane population at Bharatpur was thriving. You know, there were good numbers still, and there were several reasons that they were lost, but hunting was by far the biggest reason, and it's the biggest challenge to bringing that population back if we wanted to reintroduce them, because we haven't figured out how to solve the hunting problem, which of course was not a problem at all in India. It was all outside of India. So yeah.
Are cranes involved in human-wildlife conflict, and what are the implications of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Cranes definitely are involved in crop damage. What has happened, especially over the last 20 or 30 years, is that you have where cranes have lost habitat. They're a bird that's naturally in grasslands and wetlands. And as grassland and wetlands are converted to farmland, the birds continue to use those habitats. They're happy to eat corn, or they're happy to eat wheat. So they do come into conflict with farmers, and it's a big challenge. Here where our foundation is headquartered in Wisconsin, we are working to try to solve conflict between sandhill cranes and farmers. Sandhill cranes can damage new maize crops or corn crops right at the time of planting. So we work to develop a deterrent that you apply to the crop on the seed. It's bad tasting, but it's completely non-toxic and washes away. It doesn't persist in the environment, and it's non-toxic. But it tastes bad to cranes and other birds, and so we've developed a deterrent that actually causes cranes not to eat the grain, which is great. But the challenge is in other parts of the world where we have this issue, farmers may not be able to afford the deterrent, or it's not available. So we work with farmers worldwide and trying to find local deterrents that farmers can afford and use. But we're seeing some cases, very serious cases, where you have endangered cranes that are endangered and in decline. But when they come and feed on farmers' crops, for example, in East Africa, countries like Uganda, in Kenya, when they come onto those crops, the farmers will beat them with sticks or chase them away, attack them, kill them, poison them. And so we're actually seeing endangered birds being killed and severely harmed over their conflict over cropland. So the human-wildlife conflict is a very serious problem. We don't want to see cranes damaging farms, especially for poor farmers who can't afford those crop losses. And we also don't want to see the harm done to the cranes, which are already in peril. So it's a big challenge we're working on worldwide, but the crop damage human-wildlife conflict is a very big conflict with cranes around the world.
So what are some of the other primary threats faced by cranes worldwide?
The number one threat to cranes worldwide is definitely habitat loss. Along the same lines as the crop depredation, it's the loss of wetlands, changes in water that support wetlands. So, for example, when rivers are dammed, and there's many crane species that use floodplain areas, and when rivers are modified or dammed or water is diverted, maybe the wetlands or the floodplains of those systems no longer get water at the right time of year, or enough water to get through the dry season in monsoonal parts of the world. And so habitat loss and associated changes in water are a big factor. And in that mode too, cranes are highly affected by climate change around the world in many different parts of the world. And in fact, I think cranes are sort of the polar bears of the bird world, in that we can see, if we look at the family of cranes around the world, we can see cranes affected by sea level rise, by changing precipitation patterns, by glacial melting. There are cranes that actually nest in the meltwaters of glaciers, and as those glaciers melt and disappear, the wetlands that the cranes need will dry up. We see cranes associated with permafrost wetlands that are changing, and with water scarcity issues in general. So they're quite a good family of birds to understand the threats of climate change and how they're playing out on the lands. But overall, I would say the critical thing is habitat, and whether it's human caused problems or climate related problems, and a mix of the two, that is the biggest threat. And then you have some other threats to cranes in certain circumstances. As I mentioned, hunting is a critical threat in some places, and impact to the birds over crop damage is another threat to the birds. We also do work related to power lines and the collision of cranes on power lines. So that's a big problem where you have power lines placed in areas that are close to where cranes roost or breed. That can become a big problem. So there's diverse threats around the world, and a lot of it relates to wetlands and grasslands and the management of those areas.
You're the president of the International Crane Foundation. How did this organization come into being, and what is your long-term vision?
The International Crane Foundation was founded in 1973. It was actually founded by two graduate students who had worked on cranes for their graduate work, and were used their graduate studies to learn about cranes, and then realized that cranes were very, very poorly known worldwide. Their status was poorly known, and that we needed more conservation action. And so that was really the genesis of the foundation. And one of the co-founders, George Archibald, had worked with captive cranes for his PhD, studying cranes in captivity, and he had a captive population of cranes. And so they ended up setting up our center, our headquarters, where I am right now, which is in the state of Wisconsin in the United States. And that's been our headquarters. But over time, we've spread, and we now have offices in 5 countries in Africa. We have offices in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Zambia, and South Africa, and also office in China and in Vietnam. And these are offices that help us build up our staff with local staff in each of those countries to do a lot of our conservation work. So today, the majority of our staff are not at our headquarters in Wisconsin. The majority of our staff are in Africa and Asia, working in the places where cranes are most threatened. And then our long-term vision is really, I would say, 2 things. One part of our vision is saving this very endangered family of birds, so solving the most critical threats to cranes and resolving some of these long-standing issues like habitat loss, hunting issues, power line collisions, poisonings, and crop damage, sort of solving those threats. So part of our vision is that crane populations around the world are healthy and thriving in the land. And then the other half of our long-term vision is that we want to work through the charisma of these birds. As I said, they're birds that people connect with culturally and spiritually around the world, in Asia and Africa and Australia, here in North America. People connect very strongly with the birds, and they can be a very powerful tool for conservation. So we work with governments and local conservation partners to use cranes to try to establish new protected areas or new ways of working with communities to better support the birds. And so really trying to advance overall conservation through cranes. And our hope there is that when we save lands for cranes, it benefits many other species that co-occur with cranes. So you can have, there's very good studies, there were good studies right in India showing hundreds of bird species that coexist with the Sarus Crane, for example. And if we can protect lands for these birds or protect landscapes or even have better practices on agricultural lands that support cranes, we can help support many other species. So that's an important part of our vision too, is to work for better land use practices, better health of the land through the charisma of these big, highly conspicuous and in many places revered birds.
You mentioned Sarus cranes in the last answer. So could you just talk about the work you're doing to conserve this species?
We've worked for a very long time on Sarus cranes. They're a wonderful bird to work with. It's the tallest bird in the world that can fly. So the only birds that are bigger are ostriches and rheas and things like that. And so they're very, like 1.9 meters tall. They're very conspicuous on the landscape. And as I said, they have very strong connections both to Buddhist and Hindu religions, which is very important. They're very, very culturally protected. So the big challenge for Sarus, like elsewhere, is around habitat. A lot of our work has focused in Southeast Asia. We've been working in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar for many, many years. And in those places, we've been trying to establish protected areas where wetlands are disappearing very quickly due to industrial rice agriculture. So you have, for example, in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, where we've been working for about 30 years, most of the wetlands of the Mekong were converted to rice production. And the type of rice that's produced there is very, very intensive. It's 2 or 3 crops per year, and it's grown with a lot of pesticides and a lot of herbicide. And as a result, the land supports very little wildlife. And Sarus cranes disappeared from those rice fields, as did many, many other birds. And so there we were working to protect wetlands, to use the charisma, the reverence for Sarus to create protected areas that protect wetlands and allow these birds and other birds to thrive. So a good example is Tram Chim National Park, which was created in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, that protects cranes and many other species there. And then we've also been trying to do some very innovative work there on how to use wetlands, engage communities in using wetlands in a sustainable way that supports cranes, but also improves their livelihood. So we have a very big project in Vietnam and across the border in Cambodia, where people harvest reeds from these wetlands where cranes breed, and they use the reeds to make handicrafts, handbags, and mats and other things, which they sell internationally. They're actually marketed and sold in Korea and Japan and across Asia and into the European Union. And so we have hundreds of families earning a living from these wetlands. And now they are advocates for keeping them as wetlands rather than converting them to that very intensive rice because they're earning a living from those wetlands. So we're trying to create more models like that for the Sarus. So a lot of our work on the Sarus in Southeast Asia is really about trying to protect and restore habitat. Some great work in India was done together with the International Crane Foundation for many years. That was led by Dr. Gopi Sundar. There worked very closely with us for many years. His focus was really on how the traditional agricultural landscapes of India supported Sarus and a great diversity of bird life. And a little bit similar to the work in Vietnam, the focus there was if land stayed in these diverse farming systems that featured different kinds of crops, fruit trees, a whole diversity of land uses rather than being replaced by one intensive cropping system. When you had that kind of diverse landscape, also Sarus cranes thrived. So that it was very much about how can we create incentives to preserve that kind of landscape and that kind of land use because it benefits cranes and many other species. And so In India, I think we would say the Sarus population is probably stable. If it's decreasing, it's probably decreasing slowly, or it's a stable population. In Southeast Asia and Vietnam and all, it's been decreasing pretty rapidly because of habitat loss. So we've been, as I said, working very hard there to try and protect that flock and make sure it's still viable. And then there's also a population of the Sarus Crane in Australia, which seems to be stable. We need to learn more about that population, but it seems to be at least stable. So those are the three areas where we focus on the Sarus. And one other interesting thing about Sarus conservation is the Sarus also occur at the birthplace of Buddha in Lumbini, Nepal. And so we've been restoring wetlands around Lumbini and trying to use Sarus cranes to talk about the role of environmental conservation in Buddhism and the value of natural wildlife, natural creatures in Buddhist religion for all the pilgrims that come to Lumbini, Nepal. And so that's very much an educational project, but it's the focus there is as people can see and appreciate the Sarus and learn more about the strong cultural protection for the birds and some of the conservation challenges. So yeah, no, it's a very important species, and it's led to a lot of diverse work to try to keep the population safe in the wild.
So earlier you mentioned about the whooping crane. Could you just talk about how you are contributing to their conservation?
Yes, we do. We focus on two different parts of the whooping crane population. One is conservation of the remaining wild birds. That population is the one that got down to only 15 in the wild, so it was very close to extinction. And we work heavily in the state of Texas in the United States. The birds there spend the winter along the coast of Texas, and that part of the world is very threatened by land development, by sea level rise, by loss of wetlands and surrounding landscapes. There's a lot of energy development there and power lines and other challenges. And so we do a lot of work in Texas. We have an office there as well and staff working there who really focus on conservation of whooping cranes on those wintering grounds in Texas. And then we also are increasingly focused on the flyway of those cranes. They fly each year back and forth between Texas and northern Canada, where they breed. The good news is their breeding habitat in Canada is very remote, so they're relatively protected up in Canada. But along that flyway, which is almost 4,000 kilometers, all along that flyway, they have challenges wherever they need to stop and feed and rest on their migration and find water. Some of those areas are threatened too. So we look at the whole flyway of those birds with our special focus in the wintering ground in Texas where they're most threatened. So that's half of our work, trying to protect those remaining wild birds. And then we also have been focused on reintroducing the whooping crane to the eastern part of the United States where they went fully extinct about 120 years ago. And so we've been trying to reintroduce the birds, which has been a very long, very difficult process. We had to take some of the few remaining birds from the wild and breed them in captivity and raise chicks. And then we reintroduce those chicks to the wild. And the idea is we're trying to get those chicks that are reintroduced to pair with other chicks and then to grow up and become a breeding pair. And eventually they will have their chicks and so on and actually become self-perpetuating in the wild. And that's a very difficult process. We've been reintroducing birds now since about the year 2000 and trying to bring them back into the wild in the eastern part of the U.S. And we currently have about 80 birds in the wild, and some of those are in pairs and breeding chicks, but they are not yet self-sustaining. And we would define self-sustaining as when wild birds born in the wild that have been reintroduced but are born in the wild, like the chicks actually form breeding pairs and have their own chicks, then the population starts to become self-sustaining, so we don't have to put birds in the wild anymore. So we haven't reached that state yet with the whooping crane. So our goal is to both preserve the birds that have survived in the wild originally in the more western part of North America, and then to bring back a separate secure population over time in the eastern part of the U.S. that is self-sustaining. So that's a lot. We also have a reintroduction project with partners in Louisiana. So there's two efforts to reintroduce, reestablish breeding populations in the U.S. to increase the overall security of the population. So that's a lot of work around whooping cranes. It's a big focus, but it's one of the most iconic, the rarest and most iconic birds in North America. So it generates a lot of attention and a lot of partners to do that work.
Talk about some of the work you're doing in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, sub-Saharan Africa has 4 species of cranes. All 4 species are on the IUCN Red List of threatened and endangered species. And almost all of our work in Africa is with communities. We work with communities on communal lands, and we work with communities around protected areas. And so on the communal lands, for example, we do a lot of work in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, up in East Africa. And there we're doing work that is really focused on the well-being of the communities who live with these birds. So we do a lot of livelihoods work, trying to improve their standard of living. We do a lot of work on public water supply, sanitation, like building latrines. We've teamed up with medical clinics to provide better health services. And we really help in all aspects of trying to help people improve their livelihoods. And the idea there is that these communities are very poor, and if the communities if their well-being is not improved, there's very little chance for any wildlife to survive in those areas, because people need everything. They need to farm the land. They can't have crop damage. They need wildlife for food, and so they're very desperate in those areas. So we're really trying to increase the overall well-being of these communities so that they can better live together with cranes and other wildlife. So that's a big focus of work really across sub-Saharan Africa, especially in East Africa, where we do the most work. And then we've also got involved in long-term partnerships. We formed a 20-year agreement with the government of Zambia to manage 2 national parks. So we're on the Kafue Flats. It's a large floodplain area in Zambia, very big, very productive floodplain. It has 2 national parks, Lochinvar and Blue Lagoon National Parks. And we've joined with the government to actively manage those areas. So we've essentially taken over the co-management of those areas. And our model there is that communities that live around these protected areas are employed by the protected areas and involved in every aspect of management. So we've hired community members to do law enforcement, hired community members to do invasive species and fire control. They're even involved in research and monitoring of the areas. And then we have a big program also trying to improve the livelihoods of communities, especially where their livelihoods come into conflict with the floodplain. For example, they are breeding, raising cattle on the floodplain, and there's a very high density of cattle, and we're trying to find ways to add more value to the cattle that they're selling, so they need fewer on the floodplain, trying to find ways to make those numbers more sustainable. And so really the idea, we call that program a thriving floodplain for all. And the idea is that if we're going to have protected areas for wildlife in these areas, we need to find ways that the communities that live around these areas benefit from those areas, because if they don't benefit, they won't support them in the long term, and those protected areas won't be secure. So really our work across sub-Saharan Africa works through cranes kind of in those 2 ways, but the bottom line is community support, and that we have to support the people who live with cranes if we want a future for cranes. So, yeah.
What are some other projects ICF is involved with?
We are very involved in East Asia, and there we're looking at the flyway of 4 crane species that are all red list endangered species. And there we're trying to look at safe passage between China, Russia, North and South Korea, Japan, and Mongolia. And in those areas, we're doing supporting conservation work on breeding grounds and conservation work on wintering grounds, and then also trying to ensure that all of those critical stopover areas between, for example, the far northern part of Russia, where the cranes breed, and the southern part of China, where many cranes spend the winter, trying to make sure that those flyways are safe. And in a lot of cases, the most critical problem is water. They're migrating through areas where there are wetlands for them to breed, but the water has been diverted for other uses, like for cities, for municipal work, or has been diverted for hydropower production behind dams or other reasons. So we're trying to come up with solutions for water management that will sustain cranes and many other species that use those flyways. So we call our work across East Asia our flyway project, because we're so focused on those safe points all along that flyway and trying to make it sustainable. So that's a lot of our focus in East Asia. We work with a partner in Mongolia on another 20-year commitment to co-manage a national park for cranes. There's a very important national park in National Reserve in Mongolia called the Kirkuk-10 Nature Reserve, and that one also we've gotten involved in long-term management, trying to solve really critical management challenges on those lands, and engage with great local partners and with the government of Mongolia to try to do that. So in some cases, we're going deep into protected areas, and in others, in those areas as well, working with communities. But a lot of the issue there, I would say, is still around habitat conservation and water, the sort of wise use of water resources, and how we can manage waters that will sustain wildlife, waters that are also in high demand for people. So yeah.
Talk about your visitor center. What makes it so special?
Yeah. So our headquarters is based in Wisconsin, in the north central part of the United States, and we have on display all 15 species of cranes from around the world in pairs. So people come to see the cranes, and all the cranes are in very natural settings. So they're in wetlands, and for most of the cranes, we've created background murals that show the local places where the cranes work in the wild. And so, where the cranes live in the wild. And the idea is that we want to introduce people to the cranes and the magic of these birds and learn about the cultural connections to cranes. And we also want people to become concerned about their conservation in the wild, so they can learn more and join in efforts to protect the birds in the wild. So a big part of that is we see the birds that people see at our visitor center as ambassadors for the wild birds. So we have, for example, a pair of Sarus Cranes that people love to see because they're so enormous. And then in the backdrop, you see scenes of the natural agricultural landscapes in India where the birds occur in the wild, and some of the landscapes in Cambodia where they're also breeding in the wild. And it gives you a sense of what the challenges are for conservation, and also a greater appreciation for the birds. So really our visitor center, most of our work is in the field conservation, and our visitor center is kind of a small part of our overall mission, but it's an important part in helping educate people about the plight of cranes in the world and the efforts to try to save them as ambassadors for those birds.
So what have been some of the most prominent challenges you faced at the organization? And
well, as someone who is running a nonprofit global conservation organization, one of our biggest challenges is always fundraising and keeping all this work supported. There's so many important conservation challenges to support in the world, but we feel crane conservation is very important, not only to save the birds, but also to the potential to really work with these birds to get bigger conservation areas established, protected areas, and community areas that will benefit many other species. So a lot of our work is around that. But I would say overall, in terms of the real conservation challenges for the birds, part of it has been dealing with political stability and just different international relations. For example, we do a lot of work in partnership with Russia. And right now, there's, of course, a lot of strain in global relations with Russia. We also have cranes in North Korea. It can be challenging to work in partnership with North Korea. Many of the countries in Africa that support cranes have had difficult political situations. There are there are many places in West Central Africa where it's impossible for us to work right now or our partners to work because they're areas of active warfare. There's a lot of cranes in Sudan, South Sudan, which is in a crisis right now, and so on. And so political instability and warfare has certainly been a big challenge in keeping us or making it much more difficult for us to work in some areas. A lot of it is that, and then I think as our human populations grow around the world, and we put greater and greater pressure on natural resources, we see bigger and bigger challenges. I think challenges over water are very severe in many parts of the world, and finding a way to maintain water for people, of course, but also for wildlife is one of the great challenges. How do we find that balance? Keep important wetland areas wet, while also recognizing that there's a lot of demand for water, for energy, for food, and trying to find that balance. So that's a very pressing conservation challenge that I think will still be with us for decades to come. And again, our hope is that by focusing on a big conspicuous species that really needs wetlands, really needs water in natural areas, we can raise attention about sustainable management and use of natural resources and really help the public understand that balance. Cranes can kind of serve as ambassadors, or sometimes we call them umbrella species for many smaller species that are also very sensitive to water and habitat loss, but are not known by the public. So it's good. It's a good opportunity to work with a species that's revered and culturally understood and recognized to try and do that. So, but there are, like I said at the onset, most of the crane family, most of the crane species around the world in that family are threatened and endangered. So there are no end of pressing conservation challenges. We've been involved in crane conservation for 50 years as of this year, and we expect we'll still be involved in another 50 years just due to all the threats that these birds face.
So how can individuals contribute to crane conservation?
There's many ways to contribute. Both, of course, we always welcome people who want to become members of our organization, visit us, become financial supporters. Of course, we're very grateful for that. All of our support comes from public support. We get a tiny bit of government support, but most of our work is supported by individuals. So we really appreciate that. And people can also help through protecting wetlands, supporting local efforts to protect wetlands and grasslands that these birds need, to be a voice for conservation in the wild. When people are in conflicts over natural resources like water, we hope people will help find a place for wildlife in those needs. There are many challenges in that regard, but we have many volunteers that we work with, many people that work with us directly towards trying to save these birds, and then many people that help support our experts that are out in the field in many countries around the world, from those countries, trying to do conservation work on the ground. So we're certainly very grateful for any support we can get for that work.
What have been some of your greatest learnings from your conservation career?
For sure, my greatest learning through my conservation career is just that wildlife conservation and human well-being in many of the poorer parts of the world is completely inseparable, in that a lot of people go into wildlife conservation thinking that they're going to be working in sort of pristine environments, in working for, say, natural wetlands or grasslands and all. But the reality of conservation, I think, here in the 2020s, as we find ourselves, is that so for the family of cranes, they're really inseparable from human communities, and so much of our work really has to focus on how people and wildlife can live together. On the one hand, reducing human-wildlife conflict, making sure that the cranes are not causing harm to farmers and really solving those problems. And then on the other side, trying to find ways to make sure that people support, tolerate, or are happy to live with wildlife on their lands, whether they're natural areas that they draw resources from or their farmlands. And what's interesting to me is, some people think that getting a protected area established as sort of an endpoint. Like if we can just get areas protected, then everything will be safe. But I think, again, we find that even with protected areas, the demand for resources, the demand for livelihoods in those protected areas is very high from the surrounding communities. And there's just no way to separate that out. So whether we're trying to protect cranes on communal lands, on traditional farmlands, or in protected areas, it's really all the same. We really need to work with communities and find conservation solutions together. So to me, that's been by far the biggest lesson. And then I would say the other big lesson for us is that cranes do help bring people together, and we've had a lot of wonderful international partnerships, bringing people together that often don't work together for these cranes. You know, I'm an American citizen. We have conflict with quite a few countries around the world, but we've been able to work closely with scientists and colleagues from countries all around in the world, even countries that we don't have close relationships with right now, like Russia, like Myanmar, like Iran, Afghanistan, you know, many countries around the world, because in all of those places, there are people dedicated to conservation and the welfare of these birds. And cranes can really be a wonderful opportunity to unite people for a common cause in conservation. So we really see the role of cranes as kind of ambassadors for goodwill, if you will, and really creating opportunities for us to try to work together. And I think some of our most satisfying work has been where we forged new partnerships between conservationists or scientists or communities across different countries, and really tried to have people think globally about the well-being of these birds. They cross long flyways that are also across many political borders, and we try to recognize that those borders are in a sense artificial when you think of wildlife, and they need the opportunity to move safely and freely across those places. So I think there's been lots of highlights in trying to bring people together for conservation, lots of learnings in how to do that, and certainly overall just how essential it is, how inseparable human well-being and wildlife is if we want to save a lot of species on the planet.
And my final question for you is that what have been some of your most memorable moments throughout your career so far?
In my career, you know, I started out working in Vietnam, and I started working in Vietnam in 1988. And the Sarus Crane in Vietnam had disappeared during the war. Of course, my country was directly involved in war with Vietnam for decades before that time. And we came in as Americans back into Vietnam, in the south of Vietnam, in the 1980s, to try to work in partnership with Vietnamese scientists to save these birds and to create a new national park, as I mentioned, and also to establish some community-based conservation areas. And it's been incredibly rewarding, you know, to go into an area where we had such long-lasting conflict and forge great friendships and conservation agreements and partnerships with Vietnamese partners there to save these places. And it was incredibly rewarding to go in there and be treated so warmly by the people there, to be able to work side by side and do that conservation work. So it was very, very satisfying to be involved in that work and have a lasting impact for these amazing birds. They came back. We thought they were extinct from the region during the war, and then they came back during that period. And now at least we have a few hundred still in the wild that we're trying to hang on to. And then also, I worked for many, many years and lived for many years in Africa, had a big focus in the country of Mozambique. And there again, started working there right after Civil War ended in Mozambique. It was the poorest country in the world at the time. And we were able to work deeply in the delta floodplains of the Zambezi River. It's the place where the Zambezi River flows into the Indian Ocean. And we were able to work side by side with Mozambique scientists just coming out of the war to get a large protected area established in the Zambezi Delta. It was declared a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention. We worked to increase the conservation of that area for the wattled crane, which is another very endangered species of crane. And it was very satisfying, likewise, to be able to come in a country so poor and so recently out of warfare and really do work that benefited cranes and wetlands and the people who use those resources. We got very involved in water conservation and how to manage the floodplains there to support local fishing, people that were fishing and had livestock and had farming based on that water, and also have that water for conservation for the birds. So I think in a lot of ways, the most memorable moments for me have been where we've gone in and cranes have been part of kind of healing of relationships, and really extended beyond conservation to broader partnership with the people where we work, and forming long-lasting ties for conservation and working together. So those have been very satisfying opportunities for me in my career.
So that was the final question I had for you for this interview. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure learning about all the work you guys are doing for crane conservation.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your time. Yeah.